the whole country is in imminent danger for some time. But the danger isn't hitting big cities like New York or San Francisco. Instead, it's aimed at states in the middle where many people thought they'd be safe. But why? These places, filled with missile silos, act like a giant sponge that kind of soaks up enemy attacks. Unfortunately, this means people living there might face fatal destruction if nuclear war breaks out. But again, why put missiles in these areas? Well, during the Cold War, the US came up with a unique plan called the nuclear sponge. The idea was to keep big cities safe by putting lots of missile sites in less populated places. If another country attacked, they'd hopefully aim at these rural spots first, giving America time to strike back without hurting as many people in cities. These missile sites were buried deep underground and spread out far apart, mainly in the plain states, so they could fire north towards the Arctic, potentially reaching the other side of the planet to hit the Soviet Union. Now, what's new in this is the government wants to update this old defense plan. Even though many people don't like it, they're building more missile silos in central areas. With Russia's leader Putin making threats again, the US is spending a lot of money on this update. But it's not just expensive, it's also risky, and it might not keep Americans much safer. So, what exactly is the updated plan? To start off, the main plan for the United States to stay safe from a nuclear attack is to prevent it from happening at all. They focus on talking things out and calming situations down rather than preparing for a fight. Fixing up the nuclear sponge, which is part of their defense plan, is not a big priority right now, and some people think it's not even worth thinking about. Nowadays, it's not very useful anyway, which we'll talk about soon. But before we get into that, let's look at why the US is thinking about making changes to its nuclear sponge, where it came from, and which states are involved in protecting big cities from attacks. It's super important for people not to live in these states if there's a risk of a nuclear war. The nuclear sponge in the middle of the United States is a big deal because Russia, especially with what's going on in Ukraine, has talked about using small nuclear weapons. Even though these weapons aren't as powerful as the big ones, they can still do a lot of damage. If Russia uses them, NATO, which includes the US, has to do something about it. People worry that if Russia feels threatened enough, they might decide to use all their nuclear weapons, causing a huge disaster. This concern has made the US and NATO pay more attention and spend more money on military stuff, including the nuclear sponge in the middle of the country. This plan goes way back to the Cold War, when the US spread out missile silos across states like Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. If you check the history, the first Minuteman missile silos were set up in the early 1960s. After the Cold War ended, South Dakota's silos were closed down, leaving only 5 states as the places where the US keeps its nuclear defense stuff. Different types of rockets have been in these states over the years, but Minuteman missiles are the favorites because they use solid fuel and can be launched easily. The landscapes of these states made it simple to build launch sites that could handle lots of silos all at once. Fast forward to the 1990s, there were about 1,000 Minuteman silos and around 100 launch control facilities spread across states like Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, and North Dakota. These places were chosen because they were close to Russia, far from the coast, and not densely populated. This setup was meant to protect big cities from enemy attacks. Back in the Cold War, the nuclear sponge concept suggested that having lots of silos could draw attention away from big cities, like a sponge soaking up water. But now, with Russia having so many nuclear weapons, this idea doesn't work well anymore. They could attack both the silos and cities without much trouble. Plus, nowadays, submarines can launch missiles, making fixed silos less useful. Even though silos are easy to spot and could be targeted, it wouldn't be smart for enemies like Vladimir Putin to waste time attacking them. Now, the major problem with the nuclear sponge is that it was supposed to protect big cities. But what about the people living in states like Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, and North Dakota? It's scary to think that the government would sacrifice one area to save another. Instead of doing this, countries should focus on getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether. Now let's imagine a scary situation. What if the military found out that nuclear missiles were heading toward the middle of the country? Skilled NORAD experts in Alaska watch over America's nuclear safety. In the bright Alaskan summer, they notice a red light flashing on their screen, hinting at a possible nuclear attack. Quick to react, they inform the top brass, who immediately bring in the Secretary of Defense. The president is rushed to a secure bunker and briefed on the incoming threat. With time ticking away, the president, along with key officials, gathers underground. NORAD reports multiple missiles aimed at the Midwest. Choices are laid out. There's uncertainty about NORAD's sensors, but the president must decide fast. Should they strike now with incomplete information or hold off? But the biggest concern is that acting in the wrong lead could start a disastrous nuclear war. Opting for caution, the president chooses to wait, trusting in the systems meant for such crises. Later, it was confirmed that it was a false signal due to a mix-up caused by Russian tests, solar flares, and a meteor shower. Now imagine how catastrophic it could have been to act rashly. And get ready for a plot twist here. This story isn't real either, but it highlights the danger of false alarms due to tech glitches, a risk seen before. What if, in real life, the president comes under pressure and doesn't choose to wait? If you remember, about 41 years back, a computer bug made it seem like the Soviets launched 200 nukes at the US, nearly causing war. In 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov prevented disaster by realizing that the supposed US missiles were just a satellite malfunction. If that's not enough, connecting nuclear missiles to computers that can be hacked is a terrible idea as well. However, the US still wants to spend about $264 billion to upgrade its missile program, focusing on the old missile spots and missiles. But it's not because they need to defend better or to make the system more appealing to enemies. It's really about money for politicians and big defense companies. Companies like Northrop Grumman make a lot of money from government contracts for missile stuff. If they cut funding for things like the missile spots, these companies lose money. So they do manipulative things to make sure the government keeps spending on missiles. They spend a lot on influencing politicians, almost as much as big tech companies like Amazon and Facebook. Even though it's not really allowed, this happens a lot, and it affects how the government spends money and makes laws. Congress faces pushback from representatives of missile-heavy states like North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, dubbed the Missile Caucus, when trying to pass laws reducing missile numbers despite the inherent risks. So, why do people and politicians in these states want to keep nukes there? Well, it boils down to money again. Building, keeping up, and improving nuclear weapons and their bases brings in a lot of jobs and cash for the states involved. Many people work for the government or companies that deal with this stuff. So, getting rid of these bases could mean a lot of people losing their jobs, which isn't a popular idea in these states. But think for a moment. Instead of spending money on upgrading missiles, what if the US could use it for things like healthcare and education, which would help society more since the US already has enough nuclear defense capabilities without these old systems? So, what steps can we take to prevent such catastrophic scenarios? How can diplomacy and cooperation pave the path to a safer world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, awareness is the first step towards action. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content.